When my neighbor tried to blame my driveway for flooding his basement, he was already holding the number he thought I owed him before I even opened my front door. $3,600. A lawyer on speed dial. And enough confidence to make me wonder if I had somehow missed something obvious. The strange part was, I wasn't worried because I knew exactly how that driveway had been built. I had every permit tucked away in a filing cabinet inside my home office. Every inspection signed off by the city. Every receipt from the contractor who resurfaced it the year before. And still, when somebody storms onto your porch before sunrise accusing you of ruining their house, there's always that tiny voice in the back of your head asking, what if? My name is Daniel Mercer, and until all of this happened, I figured I had hit the sweet spot in life. I lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Ridge, the kind of place where people waved from pickup trucks. Kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, and Saturday mornings usually smelled like fresh-cut grass and barbecue smoke. I worked as a mechanical estimator for a manufacturing company about 40 minutes away. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills and let me slowly fix up the little ranch house my late father left me. I wasn't the kind of guy looking for arguments. Honestly, I avoided them whenever I could. If somebody parked too close to my mailbox, I'd shrug. If a neighbor's dog wandered into my yard, I'd bring it home instead of complaining. Life was just easier that way. Then 2 years before everything exploded, the old bungalow next door was torn down and replaced with one of those oversized modern houses that looked like it belonged in a completely different neighborhood. It wasn't ugly exactly. It just looked expensive, polished, and a little too proud of itself. That's when I first met my new neighbor, Garrett Holloway. The moving truck hadn't even finished unloading before he walked across the property line wearing spotless work boots that had clearly never touched mud. He introduced himself with a smile that somehow never reached his eyes, looked around my yard for a second, then asked if I planned to repaint my fence because, in his words, it's kind of dragging down the view. I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. That should have told me everything I needed to know. Over the next couple of years, Garrett developed a habit of treating the neighborhood like it was a project he had personally been hired to improve. He complained about basketball hoops, leaves blowing across sidewalks, trash cans sitting outside a few hours too long, and even once asked Mrs. Alvarez across the street if she planned on replacing her mailbox because it looked dated. Most of us just rolled our eyes and went on with our lives. He wasn't dangerous, just exhausting. As for me, our interactions stayed polite enough. We'd nod when collecting the mail, exchange a quick hello if we happened to be outside at the same time. And that was about it, at least until the rain came. It wasn't one storm. It was nearly a week of steady rainfall that seemed determined to wash the whole county downstream. Every morning the gutters overflowed. Little creeks formed along the curbs, and weather reporters kept using phrases like historic accumulation and 1-in-50-year event. My backyard looked more like a marsh than a lawn, but everything around my house was draining exactly the way it always had. The driveway sloped toward the street, just as the city engineer required when it had been resurfaced, and every afternoon I'd watch the water flow harmlessly into the storm drains. So when somebody started pounding on my front door before 7 on a Tuesday morning, my first thought wasn't disaster. It was that somebody must have hit my truck. I opened the door wearing sweatpants and an old college t-shirt, still trying to wake up, and there stood Garrett. His hair was soaked flat against his forehead, his expensive jacket dripped onto my porch, and his face was the kind of bright red that only comes from either freezing rain or uncontrolled anger. He wasn't there to have a conversation. He shoved his phone inches from my face, the screen filled with pictures of standing water, muddy concrete, and boxes floating around a finished basement. "You did this," he snapped before I could even say good morning. "Your driveway redirected every bit of rain straight into my foundation." I stared at the pictures for a moment before looking back at him. "Garrett, what are you talking about?" His jaw tightened. "Don't play dumb. You resurfaced that driveway last year. It's higher than it used to be. The slope changed. My contractor already looked at it." I blinked, partly because I was confused and partly because none of that made any sense. "The city approved every inch of that work." He laughed, but there wasn't a hint of humor in it. "Tell that to my basement." Then he crossed his arms and delivered the sentence that changed everything. "You're paying $3,600 for the damage, or I'll see you in court." I remember standing there in silence for a few seconds after he walked away, listening to the rain tapping against the gutters while water continued flowing exactly where it always had, down my driveway, into the street. and away from both of our houses. Something about his certainty bothered me more than the accusation itself. It didn't sound like someone asking questions. It sounded like someone who had already decided who was guilty before the investigation had even begun. And unfortunately for both of us, that was only the beginning of a fight neither of us would forget. The envelope showed up 3 days later, folded inside a larger certified mailing that I had to sign for before the mail carrier would hand it over. And the second I saw the law firm's letterhead, I knew Garrett hadn't been bluffing. He had actually filed a civil claim, accusing me of altering the drainage pattern between our properties and demanding compensation for repairs, water removal, damaged flooring, furniture, and what his attorney dramatically described as preventable structural harm. I won't lie, my stomach tightened. Nobody enjoys being sued, even when they're convinced they've done nothing wrong. For about 10 minutes I paced my kitchen with that packet in my hand, wondering if this was going to turn into one of those nightmares that drags on for months, costing everyone more money than common sense ever would have. Then I stopped pacing, poured myself a cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm, opened the drawer where I kept every home improvement document I'd ever saved, and reminded myself of something my father used to say whenever somebody tried to intimidate him. Truth doesn't panic. If I had done everything correctly, the paperwork would prove it. By that afternoon, I had hired an attorney named Rebecca Lawson, a calm, sharp woman with the kind of confidence that came from years of dealing with people who confused accusations with evidence. She listened without interrupting while I explained everything from the resurfacing project to Garrett's visit on my porch. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and asked one question. "Did you change the elevation beyond what the approved plans allowed?" "Not even half an inch," I answered. "Then let's see what the documents say before we worry about anything else." Over the next several days, we built a timeline that was almost boring in its precision. The resurfacing project had been permitted. The city inspector had approved the grading before the final payment was released. The contractor had taken elevation measurements before and after the work. Photographs existed from every stage of construction. Even better, the invoice specifically stated that the drainage direction toward the public street remained unchanged. Rebecca smiled when she finished organizing everything into neat folders. "People win lawsuits with facts," she said, "not volume." Unfortunately, Garrett had plenty of volume. At the preliminary hearing, he walked into the courtroom carrying a thick binder full of enlarged photographs, highlighted printouts, and what looked like enough dramatic expressions to fill a television courtroom show. Every time somebody glanced his way, he sighed loudly, shook his head, and looked toward me as though I had personally destroyed generations of family history instead of a carpet that, according to him, had been underwater for less than a day. When the judge invited him to explain his claim, Garrett stood confidently. "Your Honor, my basement never flooded until my neighbor raised his driveway. The water had nowhere else to go, so it rushed directly into my foundation. My contractor confirmed it. The evidence is obvious." He held up photographs showing muddy water near the property line, puddles beside his landscaping, soaked storage boxes, and cracked drywall. If you only looked at those pictures without context, they did seem convincing. Even I had to admit that. Rebecca didn't object once. She simply took notes while Garrett continued describing me as careless, irresponsible, and unwilling to accept responsibility for what he had caused. Then the judge turned toward our table. Rebecca stood, thanked the court, and instead of launching into a long speech, she asked Garrett a single quiet question. "Mr. Holloway, where did the highest watermarks inside your basement begin?" Garrett frowned, as though the question had nothing to do with the case. "Along the foundation wall." Rebecca nodded politely. "Above ground level or below ground level?" Garrett hesitated. "Below." She waited another second before speaking again. "If surface runoff entered from your neighbor's driveway, can you explain why the first visible water intrusion appears below the surrounding grade instead of above it?" For the first time all morning, Garrett stopped talking. The courtroom became strangely quiet. Even the judge looked down at the photographs again before raising an eyebrow. Rebecca didn't press him further. She simply requested that the court authorize an independent civil engineering inspection because the physical evidence did not match Garrett's theory. The judge agreed. As we walked outside afterward, Garrett caught up with me near the courthouse steps. "You're just buying time," he muttered. "The engineer will prove exactly what I've been saying." I shrugged. "Then neither of us has anything to worry about if the facts are on your side." He laughed once, short and bitter. "We'll see." A week later, the engineer spent nearly 4 hours examining both properties. He measured elevations with surveying equipment, traced drainage paths, inspected retaining edges, photographed downspouts, checked grading around both foundations, and even reviewed the original construction plans for my driveway. I mostly stayed out of his way, answering questions when asked, while Garrett followed him around pointing at every puddle left from another afternoon shower. At one point, Garrett said, "Look, you can actually see the water flowing toward my yard." The engineer calmly watched for a moment before replying, "I'm watching it flow toward the curb." Garrett insisted it only looked that way because the rain had slowed. The engineer simply wrote something on his clipboard without responding. That tiny moment stayed with me because it was the first time I realized confidence and correctness weren't the same thing. 2 days after the inspection, Rebecca called and asked me to come by her office. She had a grin on her face before I even sat down. She slid the engineering report across the desk and tapped the summary page. "Read the conclusion." I did, and halfway through I actually laughed. The report stated that my driveway complied with approved grading standards, directed runoff toward the municipal drainage system exactly as designed, and showed no evidence of contributing to water infiltration beneath Garrett's home. Then came the part neither of us had expected to be quite so devastating. The engineer identified significant deterioration in Garrett's own drainage infrastructure, including a collapsed sump discharge line, blocked foundation drainage, and long-term maintenance failures consistent with groundwater intrusion from beneath the structure rather than stormwater flowing across the surface. In plain English, his basement hadn't flooded because of my driveway. It flooded because his own drainage system had been neglected for years. Rebecca folded her hands and smiled. "We're not finished yet." She had already requested municipal inspection records connected to Garrett's property, believing there might be a maintenance history worth reviewing. Neither of us knew what we would find, but something told her there was more beneath the surface than a flooded basement, and as I watched her organize another stack of incoming documents, I had the unmistakable feeling that this lawsuit was about to change directions in a way Garrett never saw coming. A few days before the final hearing, Rebecca called and asked me to stop by her office one more time, and the second I walked in, I could tell she had found something important. Because she didn't waste time with small talk, she slid 3 documents across the conference table and said, "These came from the city's records department." The first was an inspection report from nearly 3 years earlier. The second was a follow-up notice issued almost a year after that. And the third was a signed acknowledgement bearing Garrett's own signature. Each document pointed to the same problem: deteriorating foundation drainage and a failing sump discharge system that required repair to prevent groundwater intrusion. The city hadn't just warned him once, they had warned him twice, and each time he had acknowledged the issue without completing the recommended repairs. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. Suddenly, his confidence, the dramatic accusations, even the demand for money on my front porch all made a little more sense. It wasn't about discovering what had happened. It looked more like he had already decided someone else was going to pay for a problem he had known about for years. When the morning of the hearing arrived, the courtroom felt much quieter than it had the first time. Garrett still walked in wearing the same determined expression, but the confidence that had filled the room before seemed a little thinner now. Rebecca organized our exhibits without saying much, while I sat beside her reminding myself that this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about letting the evidence speak. Once proceedings began, the judge reviewed the engineering report first. He asked several questions about the inspection methods, the elevation measurements, and the drainage analysis, all of which the engineer answered calmly and clearly. Then Rebecca requested permission to introduce the municipal records. She handed the documents to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. The room became almost completely silent as he read through each page. Every few moments he stopped, glanced toward Garrett, then continued reading. Finally he looked up. "Mr. Holloway," he said evenly, "is this your signature acknowledging receipt of these notices?" Garrett hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "And these notices informed you that your drainage system required repair due to the risk of groundwater entering your basement?" Another pause. "Yes." "Did you complete those repairs?" Garrett shifted uncomfortably before answering. "Not yet." The judge rested his hands on the bench for a moment, then looked toward Rebecca. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smirk. She simply stated that the independent engineering report found no evidence connecting my driveway to the flooding and that the city's own records established a documented maintenance issue that predated every allegation made against me. There wasn't much left to argue after that. Garrett's attorney attempted to suggest that unusually heavy rainfall had complicated the situation, But even that point worked against their case because the engineer had already explained that properly maintained drainage systems are designed to handle foreseeable storm events, while neglected systems often fail under the same conditions. After reviewing everything, the judge dismissed the claim in its entirety. Then, he granted our request for reimbursement of reasonable attorney's fees and the engineering inspection costs, explaining that the evidence overwhelmingly supported the conclusion that my driveway had not caused the damage alleged in the complaint. I didn't cheer. I didn't pump my fist or say, "I told you so." I simply thanked Rebecca, gathered my folder, and walked out into the afternoon sunshine, feeling lighter than I had in months. Outside the courthouse, Garrett stood near the parking lot for a moment as though he wanted to say something. Eventually, he looked over and quietly muttered, "I guess I should have fixed it." I nodded once. Probably. That was the entire conversation. Sometimes that's all there is left to say. Looking back now, I don't think the biggest lesson was about lawsuits or engineering reports. It was about responsibility. Blaming someone else may feel easier in the moment, but facts have a stubborn way of catching up with every story. Documents don't get emotional. Measurements don't take sides. They simply tell the truth, whether we like it or not. My driveway never flooded his basement. Neglect did. And while I never wanted this fight to happen, I'm grateful I chose evidence over anger because that's what finally brought the whole thing to an end. If you've ever had a neighbor dispute, a property disagreement, or found yourself blamed for something you didn't do, I'd really like to hear your story. Do you think Garrett honestly believed I was responsible? Or do you think he knew the truth from the beginning and hoped I'd settle instead of fighting back? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and come back for the next real-world neighborhood battle where the facts matter just as much as the drama.